Can you tell us your name, please?
My name is Corie Presley.
Corie, where were you born?
I was born in Gainesville, Georgia.
Where do you live now?
Now I live in Brasstown, North Carolina. I've always lived in Brasstown, though. Had the privilege of living in the same house my whole life.
When you hear the word Appalachia, Corie, what comes to mind?
You know, that's always a hard question to answer because a lot of things come to mind. So for me, of course, one of the first things I think about is music because I am a musician. So I think about old-time music. I think about fiddles and banjos and mandolins and guitars, and I think about people putting up food, canning food in the summer especially. I think about people crocheting or knitting. And I definitely think just about people in the way of life that overall, typically Appalachian people are friendly people, friendly faces, super family oriented. I think of mountains. My part of Appalachia has mountains. Not all of it does, but a lot of things come to mind when I think of Appalachia.
So you consider yourself, I guess, an Appalachian?
Yeah, I do. I was born and raised in Appalachia, and that's kind of a big debate. A lot of people would say, well, you have to be born and raised in Appalachia to be Appalachian. And I'm not saying either way. I don't really have an opinion. But then some people say, well, I wasn't born there, but I've lived there 40 years out of my 80, whatever, so I feel like I am because I've been born and raised here, but
you would adopt the lifestyle if you wasn't.
Yeah.
Reminds me of one of my first mountain folk interviews, L.C. Chastain. I said, what do you want to say about Appalachia? And he just really didn't even know why I was interviewing him, but I always looked up to him my whole life, and he was one of Pap's best friends. But he said, well, I don't know. I guess I'd say I'd be if I didn't live here already, I'd be getting here as fast as I could.
Yeah.
So that's what you'd say, huh?
Oh yeah, and especially about our pocket of the world in Brasstown. Lots of people probably know Brasstown for the John C. Campbell Folk School, but this is just such a wonderful place to live. The folk school has a gigantic influence in my life and always has, but just it's a small town. It's a small-paced life. It's lots of green space. There's no noise pollution. There's not really any air pollution. There's never traffic anywhere you go. You can feel safe to leave your doors unlocked at night, although really no one should probably do that. But, that for me, that's what I want and what I need. I have plenty of time and space to have, have a garden out back, have chickens in the yard. To me, that's what it's all about.
So since you mentioned the garden, so you grew up having a garden. As a garden, I should say, how is gardening or just gardening, how has that influenced your life?
Oh yeah, so some of my first memories are of what I would call the big garden that we used to have kind of before my grandpa passed away, and then the trees started growing in over it too much, and there was not enough sun, and it was just kind of like, okay, it's time to kind of put this one to rest and start a new one. But some of my first memories are of Granny would take me and Katie down there, kind of down a hill, and she would have on, kid you not, 2 pairs of pants and 2 shirts, and this was July or August. It was very hot, but to keep the chiggers out and all the bean leaves, and we would pick beans, and the rows were long, and there were several of them, and it was hours just back and forth, and then you had to break them all and string them all, and then you had to can them. So for me, that was, especially in the summer, just a normal thing of, okay, everybody has to help pick beans, everybody's got to help break them, and then, the canner, hearing the pressure of the thing on it, I can't think of the name, that goes back and forth, so that's had a huge, and then too, for me, it's normal to be able to go to the basement and get a can of deer meat, get a can of green beans, get a can of soup, tomatoes, whatever. That's always, especially green beans, always been a staple. So when I think of green beans, the only green beans I think of are in a mason jar in the basement on the shelf, which now as I'm older I see as a real privilege. But
so do you think when you think about your friends and neighbors here in Brasstown, do you think gardening is that important to most people?
I would say, at least where we would live, I would say it's a mix. I think some people, I know a lot of people do that, and you can drive up and down the road and see gardens, and then a lot of people don't. I definitely think it's somewhat geographical. I think in some states it's not as much of a thing. I think it is definitely a big thing in the South, and not only the South, but I think a lot of it is, geographical. And I would say, I don't know. I don't even know if I could say it's an even mix here. Truthfully here, probably more people don't do it than garden, but there definitely is still people here that garden.
So we'll go back to when we were talking about Appalachia, just as a general. So you've grown up in Appalachia. Did you go to college?
Yeah, so I actually went to Young Harris College, which is in Georgia. We are probably 10 minutes from Georgia, 20 minutes from Tennessee. We're closer to like 4 state capitals than our own. But yeah, so I did go to college, got a bachelor's degree, graduated in, I guess, maybe 2016.
So when you think about Appalachia, unfortunately, a lot of times there's people think of stereotypes, which those some of them exist to a certain degree. Then I've heard people say, well, there's always something behind it. But I think, how do I say this? I think sometimes you can hunt to make a stereotype true, but then you can't never just make a blanket statement. Like one stereotype that I might say, well, maybe that's true in Appalachia, is that everybody can play or sing, because I certainly grew up in a family where that was true, but then I know there's other families that was not true.
Right.
But anyway, so thinking about your years in college and how you worked hard to get that degree, that is one of the stereotypes, though, is that Appalachians are often uneducated. So what do you think about that?
Wow. There's kind of a lot of thoughts that come to mind. That's definitely a huge stereotype, that a lot of Appalachian people are just kind of like hurdy-hurdy old country people, right? So for me, though, that's kind of twofold. So I myself have a bachelor's degree, and I know a lot of people who have bachelor's degrees or doctorates or masters, and I know a lot of people that don't. But here's the kind of key or the secret about the people that don't. So perhaps they may seem uneducated, and I use that with quotation marks, because they haven't been to school. But I can think about people who live down the road from me who haven't been to college, but they're the smartest people I know. And they're the smartest people I know because they've worked outside all their life, or because they've always had some kind of job where, we can talk about, my dad included. And, he never went to college, but not to be prejudiced, he can, just because he's my dad, he can do anything with his hands, but it's because he's grown up always doing that. Or someone down the road who knows instinctually by heart how to plant by the signs and how to can. All that knowledge, that I would say that's someone who's quite smart, right? So, no, they don't have a bachelor's degree, but I have a bachelor's degree, and I can't tell you instinctually how to plant by the signs, and I can't change a tire on my car, and, etc. So life experience is oftentimes, in my opinion, sometimes more valuable than, classroom setting, bachelor degree, whatever.
Okay. When you think about another stereotype about Appalachia, is speech. So anyone that hears me immediately knows that I'm from the South, and I don't really have as much of a broad Southern accent, but I have an Appalachian accent. Most people would just think Southern. But so you have an accent. Has that ever caused you any trouble, or got you any attention, I should say?
Yeah, it's not caused me trouble, but it's definitely got me a lot of attention. It got me a lot of attention at college, which seemed odd because I'm like, I only live like 20 minutes down the road, so don't you people? But I guess a lot of people going there wouldn't sound like me because we had like a large foreign population. But so to me, they had accents, but to them, we had accents, my sister and I. But definitely, sometimes people here will comment on it, and I'll be like, I don't know, this is just how I talk. And I went up north, twice in the last couple years, and that was for sure. Everybody was like, oh my gosh, your accent, but they kind of like to hear it. And of course, to me, I was like, my accent, you guys have an accent. So
yeah. So when you think about your Appalachian culture, and it sounds like you're proud and happy to have been born into that culture, what's some of the highlights, the things that make you the happiest to have been to live in Appalachia? What stands out as some of the best attributes of it?
That's a good question. Really, there's a lot for me, I think. just the focus on family is so important. And I know that exists in other cultures as well, but there's been, at least in my upbringing in Appalachia, a huge focus on family, a huge focus on hard work, on doing the right thing, on my household, on God, Christianity, but which of course is a major part of my life. But just there's so many things. I mean, especially now that I'm older, even just thinking back to, like I said, being in the garden with Granny and picking beans, or playing with the chickens in the yard, especially years ago when we were kids and we first got them. That was a really cool thing. And even, crochet, that's a huge part of my life. And my grandma passed that down, and she learned from her mom, who learned from her mom. That's a big deal. And on that note, I would have to say, if I just had kind of a highlight reel of memories, one of my favorites would be going down to my grandma's house, because we were fortunate enough to grow up so close to our grandparents' house that I could probably throw a rock from here and hit it. And we would go down there, and that's another thing that's somewhat Appalachian for sure, I think, too, is like geographically where you live. A lot of the times it's like one family, and then they have the kids, and then the kids get older, and then they move, and then before you know it, it's just kind of like a whole family compound, which is cool. But anyways, we would go down there because they were kind of like our babysitters during the daytime, and I remember sitting in Pap's chair, and Granny would have on TV. I don't have any kind of idea what it was now, but it was just craft shows, and it would be these old ladies making stuff, and it wasn't even necessarily crochet, but I thought that was so cool, and I could sit there for hours and watch them make stuff. And then eventually she crocheted, my whole childhood that I can remember, and then eventually she taught me, and now I love it, and it's such a fun hobby, and I couldn't imagine not doing it. Definitely music, though. Gosh, that's just, music was there from the very beginning. That's in some of my very first memories. So I've got a lot of good memories about Appalachia.
Yeah, so you were talking about you get your love of crochet, which you're about to turn into Granny that crochets constantly. But what about your love of music? Where did that influence come from?
Yeah, so really from day one, there was music around, whether that was in the car, on the stereo, on the radio, whatever. But largely where the influence came from was our grandpa, which I'm sure most of you have heard about in previous blog posts and things like that. And he largely was our influence. So he played music with his brother, the Wilson brothers, and they had a band that was, somewhat famous and known kind of around here and in the kind of general southeast area. And they toured the southeast and made tapes and CDs, and they would practice in our basement before it was too junky, and they would practice every night, and that would drift up straight through the floor, and I would hear that. I would go to sleep to that, and even at family outings, it was just the norm for someone to pull out a guitar and be like, let's sing this song. And so it was very, very much a part of my life, and so we grew up singing, and I kind of like to say, I think maybe we were singing since we could talk. And, then at about 12, 13, we picked up instruments, but largely the influence was Pap and his brother and just all the music. I was just exposed, though, to a lot of music, because it wasn't just that. For me, looking back, it's even memorable. There was always music in the car. It was kind of more like bluegrass gospel stuff if I rode with Mom. It was more like old country if I rode with Dad. And we used to have this huge stereo that was like that big that sat in the house. And I can remember listening to Marty Robbins and Merle Haggard, and, it just was always there. So... But mostly the influence really, came from my grandpa.
So Corie, if you had to go back to the very beginning of what we were talking about, and you had to sum up, it's really a difficult question. I don't know if you can answer it, but if you had to sum up Appalachia with one word, what would you say?
Oh, man. Oh, gosh, that's so hard. If I had to sum it up with one word. Okay, this is old-timey a word? Sort of? Because to me that encompasses like everything that is kind of the old school of canning your own food, living the small town life. You have chickens in your backyard perhaps, and you have some kind of craft or hobby, your strong connection to your family and the land. So I guess old-timey maybe would be my one word.
it's interesting. Just I said I was going to close, but this will be my last statement. But it's interesting that you would choose that word, but yet we've already talked about during this little talk or interview that you have a bachelor's degree, that you went to college, and I might add, for people that don't know, you were very young when you got that bachelor's degree because you had already went to college during your high school years.
Yeah.
So of course that's kind of cutting edge modern technology, along with the old timey. So that's a really neat juxtaposition, I guess, of the two things. So you're a young millennial who's been to college and has a college degree, but yet those old timey ways still are what you're holding on to. So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is those old-timey ways fit perfectly in our modern world. You don't need to go back in time to live them.
No, and that's the thing for sure. You don't have to go back in time. Now sure, we don't have to preserve every single bit of our food or we starve to death. We have grocery stores, we have indoor plumbing, we have cars. I mean, we have modern conveniences, but you can still honor the old traditions and the old ways and still live in modern society. And that's one thing that I think can also be a stereotype. It's like, well, they're like backwards country people. But you can still, I feel like we're living proof of that. I don't feel backwards or odd or, whatever, but I definitely feel like I still honor the traditions and I want to. That's important to me. I couldn't imagine living life any other way.
I hope you enjoyed my first interview from Appalachia. It was a real learning experience. If you enjoyed the video, I hope you'll share it with your friends and neighbors, and most of all, I hope you'll drop back by often as I celebrate Appalachia.